I think we'll get started. Thank you once again for joining, all of you. It's a pleasure to be with you here. We've got a pretty interesting lineup for you tonight. We're going to start with an introduction from Karen Friesen. Karen is the Executive Director and the lead Arrowsmith teacher at CK2 in Manitoba, Canada. And of course, we'll hear from our founder, Barbara Arrowsmith-Young, and we'll follow her presentation with a student's experience from Michaela. And we also have Tony from Atlanta who will give us a parent's perspective. Both Tony and Michaela have experience with Eagles Landing Christian Academy in the United States. Very happy to have you join us. Thank you for taking the time. We'll also close off the session with a Q&A period, and that'll be hosted by Debbie Gilmore. Debbie is the Executive Director at Arrowsmith Program. And during the Q&A session, we'll also be joined by Misty Weber. Misty is the Arrowsmith Program teacher at Eagles Landing Christian Academy in the United States. So we'll be able to address all your questions in the Q&A. Barbara's presentation lasts about an hour. We'll remain open for questions until the top of the second hour. And once again, the webinar is being recorded. You'll get an email with a link in the next couple of days. Speaking of the Q&A, if you have any questions that you'd like to have answered, this is the time to do it. You have Barbara, you have the rest of the Arrowsmith team here. We're really excited to be able to answer any and all of your questions. Use the Q&A window that's at the bottom of your screen to post questions there. So don't use the chat. The chat is used for other communications or questions in terms of, I'm losing my words here, I'm sorry, in terms of instructions and so on. But feel free to use the Q&A window, and then Debbie will curate and sort all of those questions to make sure that we're able to provide you the best answers for all of your questions. So with that out of the way, I'm really pleased to introduce Karen Friesen. Karen's the Executive Director and the lead Arrowsmith teacher at CK2 in Manitoba. And CK2 has been a member of the Arrowsmith community since 2019. And I've spoken with Karen for the last couple of years, and I can tell you she's very passionate about what Arrowsmith does. Karen, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Fantastic. Really happy to be here. Thank you very much, Mark. We are located in central Canada. We're a bit of a different delivery system here. The reason we're part of Arrowsmith is because we provide fine arts and academic programming to the homeschooled community in Manitoba. And what happened in the last few years with all of the dynamic circumstances that we faced is that we've just really been able to diversify what we're able to do. So we started in 2019 with an Arrowsmith in-person classroom, and since then, the dynamicness of what Arrowsmith has been able to do has been fantastic. And for us, that means we are able to provide a full virtual classroom for students located a long distance from us. We also are able to offer after-school programming. And unique to Manitoba, we have a very flexible educational system where students can attend either public or private school part-time, and they come to an Arrowsmith program site for part of their day. So we have some students who participate part-time in that way, and then we have others who enter our full-time program, and we also provide some literacy and numeracy support to them as well. I think the other piece that's really exciting about what's happened in the last couple of years is that Arrowsmith has continued that tradition of being able to quantify its success. They are always doing research, and in such an exciting way, they've been able to demonstrate that whether you're in person or you're remote learning as part of a synchronous virtual classroom, the results you can expect are the same. And I think that's huge and powerful, and especially important in our region because we have one central city and then a lot of area to cover. So knowing that we can provide that academic support, that Arrowsmith support from a distance and expect the same results is just huge. I do want to introduce Barbara Arrowsmith, and then I am someone who's just always motivated by heart. So I'm going to share just a tiny bit about my family story. I'm also an Arrowsmith parent, as well as being the lead Arrowsmith teacher in our classroom. But the genesis of the Arrowsmith program's cognitive exercises lie in Barbara Arrowsmith-Young's journey of discovery and innovation to overcome her severe learning disabilities. Her inspirational book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain, has become an international bestseller. You'll see that in the slides as we go through. And a third edition, updated with new research, was published in December of 2019. Her vision is that all students struggling with learning will have the opportunity to benefit from cognitive programs utilizing the principles of neuroplasticity, programs that change the brain's capacity to learn and open these learners to a world of possibilities. Barbara is the recipient of the 2019 Leaders and Legends Innovation Award from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto for her outstanding contributions to education in Ontario. I think the real piece of this, of Barbara's personal story, is just her fortitude. In 1978, that was the genesis of this program, when she began to develop exercises for herself to change her brain's ability to work with work in circumstances that just before had been incredibly difficult for her. And what is even more profound in this is that a neuroplastic approach was completely opposed to how education is set up today, even, and even more so 40 years ago. We used to think the brain was fixed, and here she was developing exercises that actually changed the brain's ability to adapt and to strengthen its capabilities. And I think what I want to leave you with today, everyone's going to come here and something different is going to convince you. Is it going to be the research that shows statistically significant changes for people on some of those educational psychological assessments? Is it those functional MRIs? Is it Barbara's own story? Or is it something with heart? And for me, it's just that heart story that's really really has motivated me. So I'm going to leave you with a little piece from my family. But what's happened in these 40 years is that the Arrowsmith program is now available at over 90 sites worldwide. Oh, and I can't share the picture I was going to share. Oh man, but that's okay. I wanted to share my son's story because I am an Arrowsmith parent. And when he was 8, we had this really dire diagnosis that cast a future that just didn't fit with what we saw for him. He is maybe not the typical Arrowsmith student. We were told that he wouldn't achieve beyond a grade 6 level, and we just could not see that future for him. And we were so fortunate to have the Arrowsmith program come to Winnipeg at that time, and he was able to participate first part-time and then full-time. And for him, things completely changed. He is now 19 years old. Last year, he received a full athletic scholarship to the University of Manitoba. He is playing in the Hardy Cup final. I couldn't think of the name there for a second. The Hardy Cup final. He put this weekend for the Western Championships, University Championships. This is a child who, again, was told had no future of success ahead of him, and he's played for national sports teams where he'll work with coaching staff that has no idea that he's had any learning disabilities in his past. So this program has profoundly changed his life. And I want to leave that word hope with you as we enter into the presentation today, because maybe it's not something big like that. It could be things like just having the fog clear in your own thinking as you're working through your everyday. Maybe it's that piece of memory that can shift for you. Maybe your child is going to learn how to ride a bike. There are activities that address those issues. Maybe it's your kid remembering to put their dishes away after dinner or organize their own schedule. All of these pieces are part of the shifts that we see in our students because of their cognitive work. So with that, let me introduce Barbara Arrowsmith-Young. It is such a pleasure to be able to be part of this with you tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Karen, for that beautiful introduction and for sharing the story of your son. Please give him a huge congratulations from me. This is, why we get up every morning and do this work is for those transformations. So thank you. And
yes.
Thank him for having done all the work to get there.
Absolutely.
Fabulous.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so thank you. And I want to thank everybody that's here tonight or today or morning, whatever time it is where you are, for providing me with this opportunity to talk about what I'm incredibly passionate about, which is the human brain and how it drives behavior, how it shapes who we are, and its incredible capacity for change, and how if we can harness the principles of neuroplasticity to benefit learners worldwide, we can make the transformation that Karen just talked about. So my life's work continues to be an exploration of the territory of the human brain and how it makes us uniquely who we are. And I believe understanding this territory can give us compassionate insight into our functioning and into the functioning of others. So my journey to find a solution to my learning difficulties began a number of years ago in 1977. And this led to the founding of Arrowsmith School in Toronto in 1980. And then in 1996, I began to work with educational organizations to train educators to make this work more widely available. And currently, the Arrowsmith program is offered, as Karen said, in over 90 organizations in 12 countries. And our vision is to transform lives worldwide by improving cognitive capacities. And some of you might know the work of Norman Doidge. He is a research psychiatrist, and he wrote the book, The Brain That Changes Itself. And he comments on the benefits of this work. Norman says, the fact that Arrowsmith trains the brain processors that make possible reasoning and rationality is arguably one of the most important positive developments one could imagine for our world with its complex problems. So I'd like to take you on a journey of what I've learned over the past 40 plus years, a journey into the world of the brain through my personal experience, through the stories of people I've met along the way, and through the research underlying our understanding of how the brain shapes behavior, how it underlies our capacity to learn, and the outcomes of a neuroplastic approach to addressing learning difficulties. So for me, what is most promising is that we now know that through the application of the principles of neuroplasticity, which just means the brain's ability to change, the brain can grow dendrites, it can make new connections, it can strengthen existing connections, it can grow new neurons. And through this process, we can fundamentally change the brain's capacity to learn and to function. And this can happen throughout the lifespan. To me, which is very encouraging as I'm getting a little older, that there's still neuroplasticity in this brain. And at Arrowsmith, we've worked with children as young as 5 and adults as old as 85. Our brains are designed for lifelong learning, to flexibly adapt and meet novel challenges. And this is now understood and accepted as fact. So where did my journey start? It begins with my brain, and it's a very personal story fueled by my hunt for a solution to very significant and crippling learning problems. And the story is also universal, as every one of us has his or her own unique cognitive strengths and weaknesses. So I want you to imagine having a brain that's capable and incapable at the same time. This was my experience and is that of most children struggling with learning difficulties. Growing up, I lived in a world that was confusing and incomprehensible. And as I was later to discover, critical parts of my brain were not working properly. The end result of one of these weaknesses being that all language was experienced as foreign, and it was as if my interpreter was broken. And I had multiple learning difficulties. So I struggled to process and understand language, to grasp concepts, to tell time, to reason logically, to make decisions, to weigh alternatives, to see relationships from something as simple as a fraction. So I could understand the number 1 because I could see one object. I could understand the number 4 because I could line up 4 objects. But as soon as you put that 1 over a 4, it became a relationship of a part to a whole, and I did not understand it. All relational concepts were difficult. Things like bigger than, smaller than, greater than, less than, before, after. My notebooks were filled with diagrams because I tried to use my right brain in terms of drawing pictures to understand language. There were no relationships in my world. There was no cause and effect, no insight into why things happened. I was labeled as rigid and stubborn, and this was cognitive, not emotional. For me to understand something was so hard won that it felt like an attack if someone asked me to consider another way of looking at something. And another area of difficulty I had meant that I struggled to register the location of sensation on the left side of my body. I was clumsy, I was accident prone, and I was terrible at sports. And I learned early on that I needed to use my eyes to compensate, to watch the left side of my body. And I was a danger to myself. My mother thought for sure I would be dead by the age of 5 because I was always running into things, tripping over things, banging into things. And I have the scars to this day that attest to this problem. And additionally, I couldn't understand three-dimensional representation of space. So interpreting a map, navigation, geometry, geography, chemistry, constructing three-dimensional objects from a two-dimensional diagram, such as sewing from a pattern or building anything from a pattern, were incredibly difficult. And I described my world as living in a fog where meaning was ephemeral and it would just disappear into a mist of confusion, or like a series of puzzle pieces that never quite fit together. And over time, this fragmented perception of the world led to a very fragmented sense of self. And I began to view myself as stupid and as bad. And I valiantly went out of the door of my home to school every day, apprehensive and frightened, not knowing what awaited me, but certain it would be a struggle. And I did have strengths, as individuals with learning difficulties do. I had a verbatim auditory memory and a visual photographic memory and good prefrontal functioning or executive functioning that drove me to persevere and to try to find a solution to my difficulties. And my father was a scientist and an inventor, and he instilled in me the belief that if one had a problem and there was no solution, it was that person's responsibility to create a solution. And he wisely said, don't be detracted by conventional wisdom. If others say it's not possible, don't be discouraged. He said, this is how science goes forward. And for me, the solution came in combining two lines of research, that of Alexander Luria, a brilliant Russian neuropsychologist. And he worked with soldiers after World War II who had very localized brain injury. And he was seminal in his work of identifying the function of different regions and networks in the brain. And he wrote this book, The Man with the Shattered World, that changed my life. This book told the story through the journal writings of a Russian soldier who had a head wound during World War II. And so this man was describing what he could no longer do, and Luria was explaining what was going on in this man's brain. And as I read this soldier's story, I thought, he is living my life, because all of the things that he couldn't do as a result of his wound, he couldn't tell time, he couldn't understand meaning and language, he couldn't reason, he couldn't understand logic and mathematics. These were all things I had not been able to do throughout my whole life. And he used the same image in his writings to describe his reality in his journal in the 1940s that I was using in my journal in the 1960s. He said, I'm in kind of a fog all the time. And I was saying, I'm living in a fog where nothing is clear. So we were living parallel lives. So now I knew the nature of my problem. Parts of my brain weren't doing what they were designed to do. So what is the solution? What do I do about that? And this came on reading the work of Mark Rosenzweig. He was a psychologist at Berkeley, and he was studying this concept of neuroplasticity in rats. And he discovered that rats who were provided with an enriched stimulating environment were then superior in learning a maze, which is like a rat intelligence test. And when he examined the brains of these rats that have this enriched stimulation, he found that they had changed physiologically. They had more neurotransmitters. They had more glia cells and large capillaries, so more blood flowing, better blood supply. And they had more dendrite branching, which created more synaptic connections. So he concluded that enrichment and stimulation led to physiological and functional changes in the brain, which allowed for better learning. And he termed this activity-dependent plasticity. So the stimulation of the activity drove neuroplastic changes in the brain. And he threw down a challenge in one of his articles. He said, can we take this work and apply it to human learning? And I embraced this challenge. And I thought, if I could combine these two lines of research, Luria's identification of function and Rosenzweig's stimulation of function, maybe I could create a series of exercises that would work the weak areas of my brain and improve my functioning. And so in 1977, at the age of 26, I set out to see if I could harness the brain's changeable nature, with the hope that these changes would lead to changes in my capacity to learn and to understand my world. And I document this journey in my book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain, and also in my TEDx talk if people are interested. And because I had multiple areas of learning difficulty, I had to create different exercises to stimulate and work those different parts of my brain. And so how did this change my life as a result of the exercises that I created? In multiple ways. My understanding and comprehension of my world significantly improved. I could now process and understand information in real time, whereas before I talked about living in lag time. I was always behind everybody else in understanding, and sometimes no matter how hard I tried, I could not understand. Now I could listen to conversations, I could understand what people were saying, and I could actually interact. I was part of human discourse for the first time in my life. And I could read a book. I could read words, but now I could comprehend them. Before I might have to read a page 10, 15, 20 times before I understood what the author was saying. Now I could read it once, understand it, read the next page and understand it, connect the ideas. So much more efficient. I could now understand jokes. Before I would laugh when other people did, but I had no idea what they were laughing at. I was no longer vulnerable to con artists, because one of the ways you know you're being conned is you hear logical inconsistencies in what people say. Well, there was no logic in my world before, so there were no logical inconsistencies. Now I could hear those inconsistencies. I could tell time. And I no longer lived in terror that I would not understand. So incredibly profound changes. And before, I worked really, really hard with the best will in the world, and these things were not possible for me. Then I tackled the area that maps sensation to different parts of my body. And now I'm functional. I know where the left side of my body is. I don't bang into things or bump into things. And interestingly, now that I drive a car, my car doesn't bump into things or bang into things either. And then there was a part of my brain involved in spatial representation. And the outcome of working on this problem is I could now understand spatial relations. I could construct objects from diagrams. I can build IKEA furniture. I can read a map. And I no longer have to calculate in lost time. Before, whenever I went anywhere, I added an extra 30 minutes or an hour to allow myself to get lost multiple times until I found where I was going. I don't have to do that anymore. And so I concluded that I was living proof of human neuroplasticity, which wasn't believed at the time. And out of these results, the Arrowsmith program began. So we call Arrowsmith a capacity-based program because it's different from traditional education. Our premise is that we can change the capacity of the learner to learn through applying the principles of neuroplasticity. So we're not teaching content, we're not teaching skills, we're not providing compensations or workarounds. Our goal is to fundamentally change the capacity of the brain to learn, which allows learning to proceed with ease and efficiency. So we change the brain, changes cognitive capacity, changes academic outcomes, changes social emotional well-being, and fundamentally transforms the future of the learner. And over the past 40 years, I've come to understand that each of us has our own unique cognitive profile. So if each of us thinks about our own learning process, we can probably all identify areas where we excel and things that we tend to avoid. Maybe we don't have a good spatial sense and we tend to get lost, or we don't pick up languages easily, or we miss subtle social cues. And underpinning these abilities is our unique cognitive profile as strengths and areas of challenge. And in most cases, we can work around these challenges and they don't have a significant impact on our lives. A learning difficulty or learning disability, however, occurs when there's what we call a cognitive load, and a significant number of cognitive weaknesses or difficulties come together to make certain aspects of learning challenging. And I've learned that there's explanatory value in looking at behavior through a cognitive lens, that understanding an individual's unique profile can help provide insight into and explain behavior. So some examples, think of those individuals who are unable to benefit from insight therapy due to a cognitive issue. If you can't connect cause and effect, you can't develop insight into your behavior. Or people that are stubborn or rigid, it may be due to a cognitive difficulty in not being able to see and consider an alternative way of viewing a situation. Or someone who doesn't follow instructions may not be defiant, but they may have an auditory memory problem and can't retain what they've been asked to do. And if interested, there's a questionnaire on the Arrowsmith website that anyone can complete, either for themselves or for their child. And based on the responses, it will generate a report outlining one's cognitive strengths and weaknesses. And I've learned that the first step in addressing learning difficulties must be the identification for that individual of what the problem is, so we can target and strengthen the critical areas required to make learning easier. The key to addressing an individual's learning problems requires going under the label, such as dyslexia, auditory processing, dysgraphia, to identify each student's unique profile that is leading to that problem, and then have the student engage in a cognitive exercise program tailored to address their profile. At Arrowsmith, we recognize that each cognitive area requires its own specific cognitive program to stimulate that underlying function. There is no one size fits all. And I came to define a cognitive function as the job of a region of the brain or network of regions critical to specific aspects of learning. And they operate on a continuum. So someone can have superior, really exceptional functioning in the cognitive function. They can have average functioning. They might have a mild, moderate, or severe level of difficulty in that functioning. And that combination comes together in each individual to create their own unique approach to learning. And I've yet to meet someone who has all these capacities at exactly the same level. So let's look at how some of them might play out. There's the capacity to read nonverbal cues. This is critical for navigating social interactions. So think of the person who's awkward socially, who can't learn from feedback in social situations. They may have a difficulty here. Or to visual memory functions necessary for learning to read and spell. Think of the person who spells the same word multiple ways on the same page. To executive functions, critical for thinking, problem solving, planning, mental initiative. I describe this in my book as hitting the wall. Think of the person that can't generate solutions to a problem, so they're constantly getting stuck in their problems. The capacity for recognizing faces, or the ability to learn motor plans necessary for writing. So you can think of an individual who can tell a beautiful story, but you put a pen in their hand and very little ends up on the page. To auditory memory functions involved in retaining information. So think of the person who has to scribble notes everywhere in order to remember what they need to do, or the person who goes to the store after being asked to buy 5 items and comes home with 3 and has no recollection that they're missing 2, or the person who doesn't like to listen to audiobooks because they can't remember details that they hear, or the student who on arriving home after class knows that they have homework but can't remember the teacher's instructions. And then there's understanding number and quantity required for time scheduling and budgeting. So think of the person who's always running late or who runs out of money. It might be this difficulty. The capacity for grasping relationships necessary for comprehension. This was one of my challenges and led to a lack of understanding of my world. To reasoning spatially in order to navigate. This is the person who frequently gets lost, who can't read a map or takes extra time to get anywhere. And again, I encourage you to try that cognitive questionnaire on the website to get a snapshot of your cognitive profile or your child's cognitive profile. So what does a cognitive approach to understanding learning entail? Each of these cognitive functions, and we can currently identify and work with 19 different cognitive functions, plays a role in the learning process. So let's look at the reading process. So whenever we read, 9 cognitive functions come together, and each one of these plays a critical role in our ability to read. So that's why it's really important if somebody's labeled as dyslexic, we have to understand for that individual which one or combination of these 9 areas are leading to that diagnostic label, and then work on the specific ones for that individual. So let's look at one of these cognitive functions, symbol recognition. So if you want to try a little experiment, you can think of the word cat and you can close your eyes and just see if you can imagine that word in your mind's eye or projected up on a blackboard. And this is the critical cognitive function for visually recognizing and retaining symbol patterns, which go into making up words, And one researcher calls this the brain's letterbox. Another researcher calls it the visual word form area. We call it symbol recognition. So really, really critical for obviously learning how to read, learning how to spell. So if we look at strengths and weaknesses of this cognitive function, this is an area that I had a strength in. This is that photographic memory for text. If someone is strong here, they learn how to read very easily. They don't make spelling errors. Even things like math formula or chemical equations, anything that's visual symbol patterns are easily learned and retained. And if somebody has a difficulty here, this is the person that can spell the words, same word multiple ways on the page. Their reading speed is slow. They struggle to learn how to read. And again, these work on a continuum. So somebody can be gifted and have strengths here, be average, or have a mild, moderate, or significant level of difficulty. So if someone has a problem here, what do we do? The next slide shows the exercise for this area. So students go through a process of visualizing and memorizing foreign symbol patterns to stimulate and strengthen this function. And we use foreign symbol patterns to minimize compensation. The idea is that the students are unfamiliar with these symbols, so they can't attach sound to it, they can't attach meaning to it. The goal in all of the cognitive exercises is to target the specific function, removing as much as possible the compensations. And as the student goes through this process of memorizing, visually memorizing different symbol patterns, what we see improves are spelling, word recognition, reading speed, and all aspects of visual matching. And then what about the student has a nonverbal learning difficulty? The student that struggles with nonverbal interpretation of situations is socially awkward. One researcher calls this area cognitive Goldilocks, because this is the part of the brain that allows us to project ourselves into a scenario before acting and to evaluate beforehand the pros and cons of different actions in a range of situations. This is a critical component of emotional intelligence. People with this difficulty suffer from what I've labeled premature closure. They don't fully or actively survey all of the situation in front of them before acting, and then they act on an incomplete interpretation of the situation. We all know people who leap before they look. So I showed this picture to a 12-year-old girl who had problems in social relations. And I asked her to tell me what was happening. So she looked at the picture, she looked at me, and she said, they're playing badminton. So I asked her to explain why she thought that. And the woman whose arms are outstretched has netting on her hat. So this is an example of fairly significant premature closure. This girl looked at the picture, looked at the heading or the hat and the netting, and made a leap to an association with a badminton net. She didn't actively survey all the information, which clearly indicates they're not playing badminton. And in her neighborhood, this girl was ostracized socially. None of the other children wanted to play with her, and they all described her as lying all the time. Well, she wasn't lying. She just interpreted the world because of her difficulty very differently. We worked on this problem with her, and she's now an adult, and she has no difficulty navigating the social world very competently. So what are some of the features of this cognitive function? If somebody has a strength here, they would make a very good negotiator because they'd be able to read subtle social cues as a situation's unfolding and modify their behavior accordingly to get the outcome that they want. If somebody has a difficulty here, again, they struggle with social relations, they can't learn from social feedback, they can't correctly read social cues, they misapply social rules, and they do that, as I talked about, that leap before they look. They don't take in all of the information in a situation or interpret it correctly before acting. So what happens as we address and strengthen this area is the individual moves from experiencing significant challenges in navigating the social world to being able to read, understand, and respond appropriately in the world of social interpretations and relationships. And what are some of the common learning difficulties that we're all familiar with that we address at the Arrowsmith program? So here are some of them: dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, auditory memory, auditory processing, executive functioning. And again, we go under the label to understand for each individual with those diagnostic descriptions, for that individual, what are the cognitive functions that are leading to that label? Because to help the person, we have to understand what is underneath that label, and that is what we address. We strengthen the specific cognitive function. And again, as I said earlier, there's no one size fits all. Every student is looked at as a unique individual, and what do they need in terms of their profile. And then what about this concept of cognitive mismatch? I've learned that there's no part of the brain that's unimportant. So if somebody says you only use 10% of your brain, that is absolutely not true. That's a neuromyth. Over the course of the day, I guarantee you use all aspects of your brain, and each part contributes to some aspect of our functioning in the world. So the adults that we have worked with, lots of adults, and this concept of cognitive mismatch has sort of grown out of working with adults, where someone is in a job where the demands of the task isn't compatible with the person's cognitive profile. So a couple of examples. Imagine a pilot that has an auditory memory problem. So he can't remember the instructions from the air traffic controller, which is a little worrisome. We worked with such an individual, and he had some compensations. He would get the air traffic controller to repeat the instructions, but I worried, what if he's flying into a really busy airport like Atlanta, and the air traffic controller doesn't have time to repeat those instructions? So the better solution was we strengthened his auditory memory, and now he can hear and retain the instructions. I worked with a butcher who had that kinesthetic problem that I had. So he didn't know where the left side of his body was in space. And his job was, to hold a sharp knife in your right hand and cut things, but not know where your left hand is. So the first day I met him, his left hand was wrapped up in bandages. And again, we strengthened that part of his brain, so he was able to register where the left side of his body was, and he no longer cut himself. So I think this concept that we hear a lot about human error, sometimes I think it might be a cognitive mismatch. So one parent said to me many years ago, he said, school is just a metaphor for life, and these problems, if not addressed, will follow us through life. So we're going to turn to the research now. So what are some of the outcomes that we're seeing in this work? So if people are interested, there's a research section on our website. I encourage people to investigate it. There are videos of the researchers talking about the research, and they do a much better job than I will do tonight. And there are summary documents summarizing the research, and then the actual research studies are there. So please go and investigate at your leisure. And we now have a global research initiative comprised of researchers at universities in Canada, the United States, and in Spain, all studying the outcomes of this work. And if there are any researchers here tonight, we encourage you to reach out to us, because we're always interested, I think, as Karen mentioned, in doing research and understanding more about how this work drives changes in the brain that leads to changes in learning. So what is the imaging data telling us about the brains of individuals with learning difficulties? We're looking at network connectivity, and this image is showing individuals, adolescents, without learning difficulties. And there's connectivity within networks and between networks. And this connectivity is really critical for us being able to function, to be able to learn and to understand our world. So just kind of take a snapshot of this. And the next slide shows the network connectivity in the brains of individuals with learning difficulties. And a very, very different picture is emerging. And what the research is showing is a pattern of hyperconnectivity and underconnectivity. And the hypothesis is that the hyperconnectivity is a compensation for the underperforming areas, so that these hyperconnected areas are working really incredibly hard to try to do what the underconnected or underperforming areas are supposed to do. And they really can't do this efficiently, because that's not what they're designed to do. So even with all this additional connectivity and energy, the result is poorer performance with greater effort. And this is no surprise to anybody, including myself, who experience learning difficulties. The experience of someone with a learning difficulty is putting in a lot of extra effort, but not getting the results that would be commensurate with that amount of effort. And what we see also is that this can often lead to attentional problems. The brain of a student with learning difficulties gets exhausted, and it starts to wander and lose focus. And what we see is we strengthen these cognitive capacities, we strengthen the ability of the brain to focus and attend, and the students no longer have attentional problems. And what connectivity changes are we seeing? And again, this is all this research is on the website. So we're seeing students in the 10-month, academic year-long program. And then also we have a cognitive intensive program, which is between 6 to 8 weeks, where we took the number of hours in our 10-month part-time program and compressed them into 6 to 8 weeks. That's why we call it intensive. And we're seeing in both of these programs that the effect of the cognitive exercise is to strengthen the underconnectivity and to reduce the hyperconnectivity. So the brain is starting, those underconnected areas are strengthening and starting to be able to do what they're designed to do. So then those hyperconnected areas can start to relax. And this is happening in really critical networks, which the next slide shows. So we're seeing changes in the default mode network, which is that kind of I'm thinking, it's that sort of reflective network. The dorsal attention, which is exactly what it sounds like, it is attention, sort of what's going on in my world. The salience network, which is saying what's critical, what's essential, what's relevant, what should I be paying attention to? And then the frontal parietal or executive control network says, how should I act? How should I respond? How should I behave? And these are really, really important networks in processes for attention. They're the networks that are critical for regulating and directing one's focus of attention. They engage your brain to maintain attention on a task until it's completed, and they keep your mind from wandering during a goal-directed task. These networks are involved in planning, for problem solving, for making decisions, the ability to guide one's action to accomplish goals, planning for the future, working memory, the ability to hold and manipulate information in one's mind as required to perform tasks, comprehension, memory, the ability to take the perspective of others, which is critical for empathy, self-awareness, mental initiative, and efficiency of processing. And why is processing efficiency in the brain important? One of the researchers explains it this way. She says, we don't want to always have to be doing maximal effort in our brains. It's just like our muscles. If your brain is fit and accomplished at a task, you should be able to dial it down. And that frees your cognitive resources to do other things. And a young adult student summarized how these brain changes played out in his life. He said, I began to organize my thoughts more efficiently and effectively, and I began to plan ahead. First, a few weeks ahead, then a few months ahead. For the first time in my life, I had real long-term goals and was able to take steps towards achieving them. This student went on to finish a 4-year design degree and came second in the world in designing a racing car. So more activation in these networks is beneficial to all aspects of learning. It improves the learner's capacity to learn. So instead of compensating and working around difficulties, the program strengthens the underperforming cognitive functions, and then learning proceeds efficiently and effectively and with joy. So how do these brain changes translate into the real world? We see critical cognitive capacities improve. This was research done at 3 different universities, University of Calgary, University of British Columbia, both in Canada, and Southern Illinois University in the States, using the Woodcock-Johnson tests of cognitive abilities, which are standardized measures. And what we saw over 1 year in these 3 different studies were very, very critical cognitive functions changing at a statistically significant level. The ones that are highlighted in yellow, those are the areas that changed in the 6 to 8 week cognitive intensive program. The whole list is what changed in the 10-month academic program. So things like reasoning, attention, auditory processing, processing speed, cognitive efficiency, memory, phonemic awareness. These are all critical cognitive capacities that underlie learning throughout life. And then what are we seeing in terms of academic performance improving? Again, these are the 3 universities looking at academic changes and seeing, again, very significant changes in word reading, which is the ability to recognize and read words, reading speed, comprehension, mathematics, both in computation, and quantitative concepts, which is mathematical reasoning, math fluency, the speed of being able to do math problem solving, written expression, receptive language. All of these academic achievement levels improved. And what's really important in this research is to recognize that all of these students, these were students in different schools that were being researched, and they were only doing 2 academic periods a day over the course of the 10-month academic year. They were doing 1 period of math and 1 period of English, and they got all these academic changes, not because of significant academic intervention, it was because of the cognitive program. So 75% of their day, they were engaged in cognitive programs, and 25% of the day, they were engaged in academics. It again is change the brain, change cognition, change acquisition of academic skills. And there's one teacher implementing the Arrowsmith program in a grade 2 class. I think she was in South Carolina. And she said, there's something about Arrowsmith that makes students excited to try something new. I would argue that it gives students the cognitive resources to be successful when they try something new. And then what are parents observing for students that complete the cognitive intensive program? So that's a 6 to 8 week program. And these are changes that parents are seeing. They're seeing changes in oral comprehension, grasping and understanding concepts, engagement, which was looking at focused attention and mental initiative in the learning process, use of language, which included improved vocabulary, emotional intelligence, and school performance. So the students are changing, the brain is changing, they're changing on cognitive measures, academic measures, and parents are observing these changes. And what about social emotional well-being? Because that is really important. This was research done at the University of British Columbia. And what the research found was a greater sense of happiness and well-being, increased sense of locus of control. These individuals, these students were seeing themselves as agents of change in their life, which is really, really important. They also measured change in incremental theory of mind. If anybody knows Carol Dweck's work, she's the researcher at Stanford that looks at open and closed mindsets, growth mindset. These students developed a growth mindset over the course of the year. Improvements in social skills, adaptability, leadership, again, a whole number of attentional abilities improved, reduction of depression and anxiety. And interestingly, they saw a trend towards the reduction in cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And the students liked this part of the study because they got to spit at the beginning of the study and spit at the end of the study because they measured cortisol in saliva. So not only are they reporting these changes in terms of social emotional well-being, but the body is responding at a physiological level. And what are some of the key conclusions of the researchers? You know, what I like the researchers at University of British Columbia are saying is the capacity to learn new things that are changing. And that's what we argue. This program changes the learner's capacity to learn. The researchers at the University of Calgary say, if you strengthen the cognitive functions, it improves these academic skills by targeting the cause rather than the symptoms. And then at Southern Illinois University, yes, there is neuroplasticity as a function of Arrowsmith training. The cognitive exercises are activating and functionally changing particular areas or networks of the brain. So that hypothesis that I postulated 43 years ago is, you know, can cognitive exercises drive neuroplastic change in the brain and lead to changes in learning? The research is saying a resounding yes. And then the next slide just shows if people are interested, there's an organization on the west coast of Canada, in Vancouver, ABI Wellness, that is applying this work to people with acquired brain injury and traumatic brain injury and seeing the same kinds of changes. So I'm not going to go into this tonight, but I encourage anybody that's interested in work with people with acquired brain injury and traumatic brain injury to look up ABI Wellness and look at their programs and results. And then what are we seeing in students without learning difficulties? So again, there's a number of studies, and I'm going to go through them quickly. This was a study done in a school in Australia. They had 4 grade 1 classes, and these were just mainstream academic classes, and they decided to put one of the cognitive exercises related to motor planning and to writing, and motor planning and eye tracking and reading as well, into one of the classes. So 30 minutes a day, all of the students 5 days a week did this exercise. They pre and post tested all of the students in the 4 grade 1 classes. The other 3 classes did traditional writing programs. And what they found over the course of the year was the students doing that 30 minutes of motor planning improved 85% on the test is the WOLD test, which is how quickly and accurately can you copy text material, compared to 10 to 40%. So that small intervention for regular students made a significant difference. They also had 5 students identified in kindergarten as being at risk for reading difficulties, and they decided to put all 5 students into the class doing the motor planning activity. And 10 weeks into the program, all 5 students were de-identified as being at risk for reading difficulties. And to me, it makes sense, because this works that cognitive function, not only for motor planning in writing, but motor plan for eye tracking in reading. And then there's a study that's 2 studies that have been done in Spain, in Madrid. Again, these are students in mainstream classes. One group is in grade 3, one group in grade 1, and they did the reasoning exercise, the symbol relations exercise. 40 minutes a day, 5 days a week. The first group did over 3 months, the next group over 4 months, and found significant gains in visual spatial ability, planning, executive functioning, attention, and visual spatial numerical ability. And this was presented, this past July 2021, not have to change that slide, at a conference in Prague, showing the benefits for students in mainstream education. And we're continuing this research this coming year. And then a school in Washington State decided to offer the symbol relations reasoning program as an elective to students in grades 6 to 11. And this is what the students reported as seeing changes in over the academic year. So improved reading comprehension, more able to take notes, make connections between ideas. In math, they could grasp math concepts more quickly, made fewer errors, able to figure out steps in math problems. And in general learning, they felt more attentive, focused, observant, more self-disciplined, and they felt more prepared for college. So these are all things that these students reported as significantly improving. And they also use standardized tests that they used in Washington State. So the California Achievement Test and the Measure of Academic Progress, and they found improvements for these students in mathematics, reading, language, and vocabulary. So the students, again, are observing changes, and they're showing performance changes on assessments. So what is Arrowsmith program, kind of in a nutshell? The next slide shows that. It's really targeted cognitive programs that use principles of neuroplasticity, which drive structural and functional changes in the brain, which flow into improving and strengthening cognitive capacity, which changes the ability to learn, which leads to increased social emotional well-being and increased academic and career success. And there are numerous think tanks over the past 20 years have posed the question, how do we prepare students today for an uncertain future where we really can't predict the types of jobs that might be required? So what are the skills that are required? To me, the answer is simple. We prepare their brains. We put the brain firmly in the education equation. So the end result of our cognitive programs is a brain that is honed to reason, to think critically, to collaborate with others and their ideas, to be curious, to be agile and adaptable, to meet novel challenges, to be empathetic, to generate creative solutions, have mental initiative, and the grit and persistence to see plans to fruition. Our brain is our greatest asset, and we know how to harness this asset through the principles of neuroplasticity. So what is my vision? For me, I dream of a day when cognitive transformation is just a normal part of the journey of education, and that every student has the opportunity to achieve their full potential with access to both academic learning, because we go to school to learn, but what do we learn with? We learn with our brain. So let's put cognitive enhancement into the education equation. And the next slide shows a world map. This is where we are currently with our program, which is really exciting. So this is the beginning of the stream. And the next slide is the faces of the stream. These are students engaged in the program. And one mother recently summed up this work. So probably in one sentence, she summarized my whole presentation. She said, "My daughter now uses her own brain to do things where before she was borrowing mine." And this is really what this work does. It empowers the brains of students to be able to engage with the world and with the learning process and transform their reality. So I thank you for listening, and I now turn it back over to Mark to introduce some people who've had first-hand experience with the program. So Mark, to you.
Thanks very much, Barbara. As usual, your presentation generated a lot of questions, and we're going to get back to those shortly in our Q&A session. I do encourage you to continue asking those questions in the Q&A, but click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen there. Thanks, Barbara. Thanks very much for this. Next, I'd like to hear from Michaela. Michaela was a student. She's an alumni of the Eagles Landing Christian School in Atlanta, Georgia. Now I believe you're in college, Michaela. That's exciting. So you can talk about your first-hand experience with Arrowsmith as a student. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This is definitely an honor and a privilege. And I love talking about Arrowsmith because of its impact on my life personally, and even my classmates. I got to see it not only change my life, but also my fellow classmates' lives. So a little bit about me. My name is Michaela, and I am from Atlanta, Georgia. And when I was 10 years old, I was in a life-threatening car accident. And I had many injuries, but one of them that really impacted my life day to day was a traumatic brain injury that I had due to a brain bleed that I had suffered through. From the brain bleed going into rehab, they tried to physically rehabilitate me, but mentally I was very far off. And in the hospital, they don't really try to rehabilitate your brain, but only your physical attributes. And so after I graduated from rehab, I went back to school, in a brand new school. I had actually just moved to Georgia. And so I was in a brand new environment and a broken or a damaged brain. And so I moved schools multiple times because I was a sixth grader, but in a third grade level academically. And so that was a really big bummer for me because I wanted to succeed in school so badly, and I just couldn't. And so I finally ended up at Eagles Landing Christian Academy in McDonough, Georgia. And one of the main things that made me want to go to ELCA is because of the Arrowsmith program. This is a new solution for my damaged brain. And I had memory issues. I wasn't exactly diagnosed with a specific disability or difference, but I always struggled with like reading, writing, math just didn't make a lot of sense to me. I was very slow, needed a lot of extra time and care to understand basic knowledge in school. And so the Arrowsmith program, I was in there for 2.5 years through middle school, and it changed my life completely. I went from a third grade academic level to catching up with my my actual what I was supposed to be in 8th grade, and in a matter of 2.5 years, which is so fast. And it truly has changed the rest of my life. Academically, in high school, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to go into normal classes again to be with the rest of my class, but I gradually went back into those normal classes, and I made A's and B's, and I didn't even think college was even a solution or an option for me. And I'm now attending Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and with a 3.5 GPA. So the Lord, everything is good, and I'm so thankful for the Arrowsmith program. Has really just impacted me so much. I'm able to remember things better. I'm able to plan things way better than I used to be able to. I used to have to like write down everything, much like what Barbara Arrowsmith was talking about. Just all of those things, a lot of the things that she was mentioning earlier, just like resonated with me, and just taking me back a little bit, because that was definitely me. I was definitely that kid who had those issues, and now I'm in college, my sophomore year of college, and I am totally I'm sustainable. I'm able to comprehend things easier, and yes, so I'm just so thankful for the Arrowsmith program. So thank you guys for having me.
Oh, thank you so much, Michaela. Thanks for sharing your story. So pleased to hear about your progress and your success. Your story is really amazing and it's inspiring. Barbara earlier mentioned ABI Wellness, and that's an organization that's using the Arrowsmith program exercises in a clinical setting specifically for acquired brain injuries. And like you, their clients are seeing amazing results. So very exciting to see this new application for cognitive exercises, and really happy again to hear about your success. Thanks for sharing. Thanks, Mikhail.
Yes, thank you so much.
Next, I'd like to introduce Tony, whose children are attending Eagles Landing at the moment. Tony's point of view will come from a parent, which is also very insightful. Tony?
Hi there. Thank you for having me. My name is Tony Lockhart, and I have a 12-year-old son in the Arrowsmith program. And my daughter just started this year. She's 8. But it's my son's 3rd year in the program. So he was diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia after his English teacher advised us that he was having problems with reading comprehension and grammar mechanics. So after he was diagnosed, we tried a couple of different programs. However, the problem was they focused on the symptoms instead of the underlying causes. And so I chose the Arrowsmith program because it is more comprehensive, it emphasizes a growth mindset, and it focuses on improving cognitive abilities by targeting and strengthening areas of weakness. So about halfway through his 1st year in the program, I noticed some changes in his personality and his abilities. He started drawing logical conclusions and thinking independently. Previously, I would have to guide him to the right conclusions so he wouldn't make what seemed to be random guesses, but it was logical to him, but it just wasn't logical to me. He was able to somewhat control his emotions a little bit better. So whereas previously he would get frustrated when trying to express his thoughts, and I saw after being in the program, he was able to kind of pick his words more carefully to get his ideas across. And so he felt like he was being heard. And so he was also began to be more confident as he worked through the Arrowsmith program. He began to develop this growth mindset, and he became more confident in his abilities. And so now he's willing to try more challenging tasks, as opposed to in the past, he would avoid challenging tasks if he thought it was too difficult. And so this year, he's still working through the program. He's averaged out in most of his cognitive functions, but he's still working on strengthening his working memory to retain instructions and numbers. But one of the greatest achievements he's had this year is he was inducted into the National Beta Club, which is awesome. Not only because he is maintaining an A&B average, but he's doing the work himself. I don't have to look over his shoulder to make sure he's getting his work done or he's getting it accomplished. I kind of ask him, hey, you're getting your work done, you're getting your homework done? And he's like, yeah, Dad, I got it. But so now he's more independent, and he's doing the work himself. So overall, I've been very pleased with the program, been extremely satisfied. And if he were here, he would tell you the same. He's been pleased with it as well. But that's been my experience. Oh, I'm sorry. And my daughter, she's just started in the program this year. And so we're still working on her growth mindset, which has been the hardest thing for us. But we've been working on that for a couple of years. But as soon as she turns that corner, I think she'll be making the same progress as my son. So, but that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tony. It's really great to hear about Joshua. I mean, his progress, his newfound independence, that's got to be life-changing for you guys.
Definitely, definitely. Before we did a I was working with him on what I call the shadow curriculum. So when he finished his work in school, I would work with him on my own intensive program to get him more instruction so that he would be more prepared in class, which was exhausting for me and frustrating for him because he was doing double the work that his peers were doing.
No kidding. Oh, that's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Tony. Really appreciate it. And best of luck for the upcoming work with your daughter as well.
Thank you.
That's awesome.